Hello. So in this video we're going to talk about Euripides' play Iphigenia in Aulis. Now this is a really interesting play, in part because it's Euripides' last play, probably. He almost certainly didn't write the ending to it. And we're going to talk about the ending, because the ending raises some problems. But Iphigenia in Aulis is part of the larger Atreidae cycle, which includes Aeschylus's Orestes, it includes Sophocles' Electra, it includes Euripides' Electra, as well as Euripides' Orestes and Euripides' play Iphigenia among the Taurians. Now, Iphigenia in Aulis is basically about the sacrifice of Iphigenia before the beginning of the Trojan War, so that the Greeks could sail to Troy. It takes place in the Greek camp at Aulis, where their ships are becalmed. They are becalmed because Artemis has a beef with Agamemnon. And so in order for the Greeks to sail, in order for the winds to blow, Artemis Demand, and this play doesn't specify what Artemis's problem is, but from other plays and from other mythological sources, we know that at one point Agamemnon had been hunting deer, which was an activity sacred to Artemis, and he proclaimed that he was better than the goddess at hunting. Which, if you know anything about Greek myth or tragedy or literature, is not a thing that you want to do. That is what we in the business call hubris. And so Agamemnon here is being punished for that. Artemis demands that before the Greeks can set sail, Agamemnon has to sacrifice his daughter to her, and then she will allow the Greeks to sail. So that's taken place sort of that has been sort of worked out before the beginning of this play. And we open with Agamemnon actually having a crisis of conscience in which he is going to send a letter back to Mycenae, back to Argos, where he's from, and basically tell Iphigenia not to come. Menelaus intercepts the letter. They have a big fight. And basically they go back and forth. And here we actually start to see something really interesting, because both Menelaus and Agamemnon end up changing their minds several times over the course of the play. Neither of them seems to work from innate ethical principles. Instead, they work from what's most convenient and what's going to look best to the army. Anyway, Iphigenia and her mother Clytemnestra, Agamemnon's wife, arrive in camp. They think there's going to be a wedding. Agamemnon is setting up for the sacrifice. Achilles shows up. Not super chuffed that Agamemnon has used his name in this ruse to get Iphigenia to come to the camp and be sacrificed. But he eventually ends up sort of taking a shine to Iphigenia and eventually pledges to support her. So Iphigenia agrees to be sacrificed. That's the short version of it. I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit, because it's an interesting bit. So Iphigenia agrees to be sacrificed for the sake of Greece, the sake of the army. And then the play basically ends with a reporting of her sacrifice, in which, at the moment that the priest cuts her throat, she is replaced by a deer, by Artemis. Artemis replaces her with a deer and takes Iphigenia to a location unknown, although if we had followed Euripides' career prior to this, know that Artemis takes her to Taurus, because his play Iphigenia among the Taurians is an earlier play. So, that's basically the plot. But it's an interesting play in part because this is Euripides at the height of his cynical powers. And that's one of the things he's known for as a playwright, is his sort of cynicism, but also his ability to develop emotional and psychological complexity with a lot more depth than most other Greek plays that we have. So I want to read you first the opening bit of this introduction by Paul Roche, the translator of this Signet Classics collected edition, because I think he brings up some really important points, and I want to talk through some of these ideas. So he says, Iphigenia at Aulis, together with possibly the Orestes and Cyclops, and certainly the Bacchae, is among the last plays that Euripides wrote toward the end of his life, when he was the guest of King Achilles of Macedon. The Iphigenia proved to be his very last, and was left unfinished when he died in 406 BC. It is thought to have been completed by his son, who produced it shortly afterward at the city Dionysia in Athens, together with the Bacchae and a lost play, the Alcmaeon. It appears to be this trio for which Euripides was posthumously awarded first prize, only for the fifth time only, compared to 13 times for Aeschylus and 18 for Sophocles. Iphigenia at Aulis marks the culmination of Euripides' career as playwright and poet, not because this is his greatest play, but because it is in many ways his most interesting, for in it he pushes to an extreme his dislike for the heroics of Greek tragedy and shows his characters to be pathetically and almost endearingly human. The mighty Agamemnon, stripped down to his naked pomposity, is no more than another well-meaning but fumbling politician. His sidekick and brother Menelaus fares no better. The swashbuckling Achilles, answer to a maiden's prayer, is a flashy, commonplace juvenile that could be waiting in his Porsche for his date at the high school gates. Even Clytemnestra, though a queen, is the kind of queen who rides a bicycle to the supermarket and trundles her trolley like any suburban housewife. Only Iphigenia, in her courage and simplicity, rises above the mediocrity and vulgarity of the rest of them. In this reduction of the heroic to the ordinary, Euripides focuses on the psychology and probability of human beings as they are, and so opens the door to all we know about modern drama. So that's an interesting introduction, and I think it's really quite spot on in terms of how this play moves. Almost all of the characters are ridiculous, reprehensible, in some way ignoble. I mean, I think in some ways this is a play centrally concerned with the idea of nobility and what nobility means. Because one of the things is we do actually have several speeches in which Agamemnon, for instance, will say, "Oh, I'm really envious of these common people because fate doesn't come along and ruin their lives or force them into these terrible situations," or whatever it is. But there's also places in which we get common people, whether that's the chorus or groups of soldiers or whatever it is, who will talk about how much better it is to be rich and powerful and like the gods. Again, we've got that element of hubris there. So that idea of nobility is really central here. And one of the things that Euripides does is takes apart the idea that nobility is an innate characteristic of the aristocracy or of the warrior class, of monarchs. Because Agamemnon and Menelaus are both fickle, they're both fairly weak, they don't have any real ethical core to themselves. But I actually think Achilles is the most interesting character in terms of this nobility is only skin deep type idea, because at first when Achilles shows up, he's very fancily decked out with a two-plumed helmet and fancy duds and whatnots, and he comes in and basically he's somewhat narcissistic. He's certainly ego-driven. He's very willing to accept the idea that he's attractive, that he's handsome. He would be a great catch. But he also comes in primarily upset about the fact that Agamemnon has used his name to get Iphigenia to come, because Agamemnon had told Iphigenia in his message that she was going to be marrying Achilles, and he didn't ask Achilles' permission for this scheme, and that's primarily what Achilles is upset about when he first enters. The fact that she is literally about to be sacrificed is secondary at best to him. So initially he's not a particularly admirable figure necessarily. Like, he cuts a fine dash, but there's not much substance there. But, interestingly enough, when Iphigenia says, you know what, I choose to be sacrificed for the glory of the Greeks, he has this sort of change where he says, he sort of recognizes that nobility in her, and he says, I'm going to go to the altar of Artemis. If you change your mind, you let me know, and I will fight everybody to keep you safe. So again, we have this great depth and complexity to Euripides' characters, even as they are buffoons, even as they are fickle, even as they are whatever it is, whatever negative characteristic they have. But I want to talk in a little bit more depth about Iphigenia's nobility, because that's really one of the central moments of the play. So she says here, Mother, listen to what I think. I see how angry you are with your husband, but it does no good. The odds against us are too great. So let us thank this young man for his courage, but not let his reputation suffer with the troops. We should fare no better, and he would face disaster. But the remarkable thing, Mother, as I think it over, is that I am willing to die, and die gloriously, after putting every petty thing behind me. On me the sailing of the fleet and overthrow of Phrygia, on me the remedy against any barbarian carrying off our women from a happy home, should such a thing enter his head. All this should my death accomplish, and my name shall be blessed as the liberator of Greece. So I must not cling to life. I was born from you not simply for your sake, but for the common good of Hellas. 10,000 men are armed with shields, 10,000 men grip the galley oars. Their country has been hurt, and they are brave enough to be warriors against the enemy and die for Greece. Is my life to be the only obstacle? Would that be fair? How can I defend it? And another thing, it is unthinkable that this man, meaning Achilles, should pit himself against the whole of Argos for a woman's sake. A single man is worthier to look upon the light than 10,000 women. If Artemis is determined to have my carcass, shall I, a mortal female, cheat the goddess? No, I give my body to Hellas, so sacrifice me and sack Troy. That will be my memorial through the ages, and will be my marriage, my children, and my fame. For the Greeks to govern barbarians is but natural, and no wise mother for barbarians to govern Greeks. They are born slaves, Greeks are born free. So we've got a lot to unpack here. First off, this idea that I will sacrifice myself, and that will be my glory, that will be the Greek term would be kudos. Kudos would be reputation, one's sort of eternal reputation. For us today, I think this is much harder to sort of get behind. We still have the idea of self-sacrifice for a greater cause, but it's not necessarily as central to our culture as it would have been for the Greeks. But for the Greeks, this was peak heroism. This was the kind of thing that you did if you were one of the great heroes or demigods, people like Achilles, apart from Euripides' cynical version, people like Ajax, all of these people who sacrificed themselves, who gave of themselves. This is something that's incredibly important in the Greek ethical scheme. So we have that element, but we've also got some other things that are problematic, probably from today's perspective. Like this claim a single man is worthier to look upon the light than 10,000 women. No, first off. But this is a challenging bit, I think, for modern audiences. This is not necessarily a thing that we would get behind. And this idea that for the Greeks to govern barbarians is but natural. Again, we're in a post-colonial world. We're in a world where we no longer necessarily endorse, even though in practice it still often exists, the dominance of one group of people over another group of people based on ethnicity, race, whatever it is. So again, we have some problematic elements here, but these are things that would have been pretty well aligned with the Greek worldview. And again, that idea of nobly sacrificing oneself for the common good, the greater cause, etc., would have been something very appealing to the Greeks. So, that being said, there are some problems this play brings up. There's one major problem this play brings up, and one issue I have across the board with any play involving Orestes. So the big issue that this play brings up, and it's worth noting that this is from almost the very end of the play, after the portion where Paul Roche has said, this is the bit we don't think Euripides wrote. So this is part of the section that Euripides' son probably wrote, rather than Euripides himself. Well, we have a messenger come in, as is often the case toward the end of Greek tragedy, and this messenger says, then suddenly a miracle took place. All of us heard the plunge of the stroke, that's the knife cutting Iphigenia's throat, and none of us knew where on earth the maiden had vanished. The priest gave a shout, and the whole army echoed him as they beheld a prodigy, an unearthly phenomenon. A deer in spasms lay panting on the ground, a large and handsome hind, all the altar was speckled with her blood. Then Calchas spoke, you can imagine with what joy. Commanders of the Panhellenic and thwarted host, do you see this victim which the goddess lays upon her altar, this hind from the hills? Far more welcome to her is this oblation than a maid, that she may not tarnish her altar with noble blood. So, a messenger has come on, and he's reported to Clytemnestra that when the sacrifice of Iphigenia was about to take place, Artemis saved the girl and replaced her with a deer. Now, again, this is central to Euripides' earlier play, Iphigenia Among the Taurians, but it introduces a major problem for the rest of the myth cycle, because when Agamemnon gets back after the Trojan War, Clytemnestra murders him for having sacrificed their daughter. But in this play, she learns that he did not actually sacrifice their daughter. He attempted to, but Artemis saved her. So if Iphigenia doesn't die, then Clytemnestra's claim that she's killing Agamemnon because he killed Iphigenia completely falls apart. So there's that element of it. The other element is Orestes' age. And this is I've talked about this in other videos, but Orestes' age is a huge problem for me, because he's in this play as a baby, which is fine. That's actually the most logical thing, because Agamemnon, I mean, he's been in Aulis for a little bit, but he hasn't been gone that long. Like, Iphigenia, or Clytemnestra could have their baby, Orestes, and then Agamemnon could go to Aulis, and Orestes would still be a baby by the time the events of this play happen. Totally on board with that. But in Aeschylus' Oresteia, in Sophocles' Electra, in Euripides' Electra, they all say that Orestes was a baby when Clytemnestra kills Agamemnon, which she does after he returns from the Trojan War, which means that Orestes spends over a decade being a baby. I don't know that much about how babies work, but I know that typically if you're 10 to 12 years old, you're no longer considered a baby. So, that, I don't know, it bothers me. Maybe I probably just need to let that go and just accept that the timeline is not going to make sense because it serves a mythical purpose and not an actual reasonable purpose. But yeah, it bugs me.